Hello, everyone. We will get started soon. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Olsen, and I am the project officer at EENA. Just a few housekeeping tips before we get started. We have automatic captions that will be available. You can see on the screen here how you can activate that. And without further ado, I just wanted to welcome you all today to this webinar. So we will be exploring an EU-funded project which is focusing on enhancing public safety. So this project represents significant advancements in efforts to improve emergency services and ensure the safety and well-being of communities in Europe and beyond. So today's webinar is a testament to our commitment to staying at the forefront of research and innovation in the public safety sector. It is also an invaluable opportunity for members of EENA to stay up to date with the latest developments, to share knowledge, and to collaborate on initiatives that make a real difference. As many of you know, EENA is frequently involved in EU projects. We have an extensive network, and our numerous events have always been a cornerstone of activities that are carried out within these projects, which helps to provide direct links to relevant stakeholders and fostering meaningful collaborations. EENA staff and members bring a wealth of expertise in emergency communications, crisis management, and disaster response. And our deep understanding and technical proficiency allow us to lead and to participate in activities that demand high involvement from end users and other stakeholders. We are particularly adept at gathering end user requirements, evaluating project results, and involving external stakeholders. Moreover, EENA is also committed to enhancing the visibility of project outcomes through robust communication and dissemination efforts. As we look to the future, we are excited about the new calls for proposals that are opening soon. EENA is well positioned to be considered as a partner in these proposals, given our extensive network expertise and proven track record in the implementation of EU-funded projects. So we encourage all participants to consider EENA as a partner for your future projects. And if you would like to connect with us, there is contact information at the bottom of this slide. So today I'm excited to present the EU-funded project called MEDiate. So they are kicking off our webinar series dedicated to highlighting the achievements of EU-funded projects. And I am pleased to present Dr. Abdelghani Meslam. He is a senior research engineer at Norsar in Norway and the coordinator of the MEDiate project. We also have Dr. Gemma Kremen. She is an assistant professor in risk and resilience engineering at University College London in the United Kingdom. And we also have Dr. Matthew James Roberts. He is the managing director, Service and Research Division at the Icelandic Meteorological Office in Iceland. So I will go ahead and pass the floor to the MEDiate team. I'm looking forward to a very insightful presentation and a great discussion.
Hello, everyone. So this is a MEDiate project, a multi-hazard and risk-informed system for enhanced local and regional disaster risk management. We are very pleased and very happy to be here, and thank you for this opportunity to share the work that we have been doing for the last more than 20 months left gone already. For this European project that involve so many partners with the different backgrounds, researchers and practitioners also involved in this project. So today's presentation, as it was announced, it will be shared between myself, Dr. Abdelghani Mislam. I'm the coordinator of MEDiate project. I'm also a senior research engineer at MOSA and associate professor at Norwegian University of Life and Science. I have also with me Dr. Gemma Kremen. She will be presenting the part 3 of the presentation, and Dr. Matthew James Roberts will present the part 2 of the project related to hazard. Today's presentation has 3 main parts. So the first part, which will be presented by myself, it will be on the project, a general overview of the project. What are the challenges and the objectives the project is addressing and wants to reach? And then the part 2 will be presented by Matthew about definition of multi-hazard interaction models for impact risk-based assessment. And part 3 by Dr. Gemma Kremen about integrating dynamic multi-hazard vulnerability and resilience into formal people-centered and forward-looking risk assessment. So I'll start with the part 1, which is, as I said, it's to provide a general overview of the project. What are the novelty and what are the added value that we are bringing here and the exportable results of the project. So who we are as a consortium. So MEDiate Consortium has 18 partners from 7 European countries: Norway, Netherlands, Austria, France, Italy, Iceland, and United Kingdom. So in total, we are 8 research centers and industry, 4 universities, and 8 local and regional authorities represented by the disaster their disaster management organizations. So the background, we basically represent a multidisciplinary team. We have a representative of scientific area like meteorological, environment, geophysical. We have civil and risk engineers. We have also involvement of social science, technology, business economists, and we have, as I said, disaster managers representing the local and regional authorities from 4 European countries. MEDiate was submitted to a call, at that time was titled Enhanced Assessment of Disaster Risks, Adaptive Capability and Scenario Building based on available historical data and projections. And the reason why we submitted this project was the fact that we know the actor in disaster management still struggle to plan integrated adaptation and risk mitigation strategy. So the main objective of MEDiate is to address some of those challenges at the level of preparedness of societies and management of disasters, and also to understand these decision makers' needs for them to successfully plan efficient risk and mitigation strategy. So we have identified through this project some of the number of those challenges at the level of preparedness, societies, and as I said, to understand also decision-making needs. So the first one was the risk governance system, the fact that risk governance systems are oriented toward a single approach with respect to the hazard risk, where different of those risks are being addressed by different governmental agencies. So you have the agency that deals only with floods, other deals only with maybe earthquakes. So there is no kind of interaction between them. The second major challenge that we are trying also to address through this project is the fact that risk analysis are not performed from a multidisciplinary perspective, where we are integrating altogether the physical, economic, and social impact and see the connection between them before coming up with the efficient evaluation of our modeling of the risk. The last one is related to the fact there is a lack of mechanism for interaction between the different players, the technical agencies, the actor in disaster management, policymakers, critical infrastructures providers, and business organization. This was the third main challenge that we are addressing, try to address in this project, and coming up with a solution that helps to enhance the situation. So, to address the issue of single approach in existing risk governance systems and in risk analysis. So the MEDiate project is working toward enhancing societal resilience against multiple interaction, natural hazard, and impact by providing a risk manager with a decision support framework that account on three main aspects. One is strategic focus through this resilience informed, which will be discussed by Gemma later. The other is the tactical focus related to people-centric, the most vulnerable people. And the last one is the operational focus, service-oriented, basically depending on user preferences and priorities. So these are the main aspects that the system or the framework that we are trying to develop through this project. This is being done through a number of technical activity that we are working on. And the aim of those activity, there are 8 activities, is one, to improve the multi-hazard assessment, highlighting potential trends due to climate change, and also on improve the multi-hazard risk assessment, accounting for the interaction and trend in their components. Also working on advance beyond the state of the art in multi-hazard risk approach, new research that is being going. And finally, we want to provide end users with a means to visualize potential scenarios and model the impact of mitigation through this web-based MEDiate DSS platform. This slide shows, this next slide shows the main product of the project, which will be a scenario-based platform where we integrate the hazard exposure and vulnerability information of physical or social components. And from there, we can compute and visualize the physical and social risk. This kind of system that we want to develop, the aim is to offer a clear visualization of the physical and social interdependency between the exposed and damaged assets to assist the decision-making process. There is also this option of automated disaster mitigation algorithm, which has been also is ongoing to be implemented in the system to help with the process. One of the most important steps also in the project that has been carried out in order to address the issue related to the lack of mechanism of interaction is to define common understanding of disaster risk resilience between those different discipline and actors, because we believe that this is one of the first obstacle. Maybe this is one of the first obstacle why there is no interaction between the different disciplines. So we need to come up with this common understanding. And basically, this is about to address the decision-making needs of various stakeholders. So improving the interaction between the different technical government and agency in order to enhance the modeling of risk to the built environment and people. In doing so, basically, the interacting natural hazard and impact can properly address it through this cooperation between the different disciplines and specialized professional. Not only that, but also the cascading impact in risk and resilience assessment can also be properly addressed through this collaboration or cooperation. This is a project where stakeholders are engaged because I think this is the key factor that for a successful product that can be taken up after the project is finished is to get the stakeholder involved during the co-design, during the design phase and the development and the evaluation. So we have this concept of this approach of co-design, co-development, and co-evaluation with a stakeholder. We are working together, practitioners, researcher, software development, to ensure that the DS system that we are developing is user-led, supported by appropriate technology. And we have 4 test beds that have different demography, cultural, geographical, and geopolitical condition for the evaluation and for the interaction with the stakeholder and their associate partners to co-design and co-evaluate and co-develop the system. Here we show an example of direct interaction with various stakeholders during the co-design phase of the platform. And we were trying to understand what are the different priorities and expectation of the testbed stakeholder. Here it shows a page where this is an example of the web-based MEDiate DS platform. Here, where it allows to choose or add the new test beds where you can work, and then basically provide the information. This shows the homepage of the given test bed. Here, for example, I'm showing an example of Oslo, so where you have some informational layers displayed, which can be configured by a testbed manager, and also additional data can be added later for the given testbed. And then you can have this is example of list of some of the scenarios, flood and other scenarios that we have been that have been computed. And then from there, you can select a scenario in order to visualize the result and launch new scenario, for example, to evaluate a given strategy. Like here, for example, it shows one of the scenarios that was carried out and showing the results on map, the different way of showing the results. Here, scenario for the calculation tools. After selecting an exposure, for example, or an area, then you can run a scenario assuming either no or with mitigation, so different mitigation actions that you can be configured by the user, and then you can see the effect of mitigation action when it's combined during the calculations, and then how this a given mitigation action is performed. So multiple scenario can also be added and visualized, and then you can, by selecting scenario, you can view the corresponding risk and resilience metrics, and also several indicators can be displayed, such as the number of people involved, cost of mitigation action, repair cost. From here, you can basically invoke the multi-criteria decision engine to determine what best strategy to adopt. And then you can, of course, see the range of values to weight the properties. So with this, I would like to thank you for following the first part. And this is pictures of all the people who are being involved in the MEDiate project. I would like to thank them also. And then from here we go to the next slides, which will be presented by Dr. Matthew James Roberts, a definition of multi-hazard interaction model for impact risk based assessment.
Thank you, Abdulghani, and hello to everybody. My name is Matthew from the Icelandic Meteorological Office. It's a pleasure to talk to you all today. I'll have an approximately 10-minute presentation covering part 2 of this webinar. I'll be discussing now how we go about defining multiple hazards within the MEDiate project, and how we created a series of test cases that are then used for later impact-based risk assessments. One of the main messages from this summary that I'll give in the next few minutes is that there is a need for a paradigm shift in terms of how we handle and assess natural hazards. We often think about hazards occurring in a singular sense. Occasionally we discuss hazards that occur concurrently, but increasingly we know from just our everyday impression of how the natural environment interacts with the built environment and disrupts our daily lives. We know that severe weather, for instance, can lead to all sorts of different cascading and consequent hazards and ultimately risks. And this is what we wanted to capture in this research and make sure that all of these different factors could be modeled, quantified, and put into the risk assessment system that Abdulghani outlined. So next slide, please. So there were 2 main objectives within this part of the project. As I mentioned, the first objective to generate new methods, evidence, and knowledge related to multiple hazards and how they can cascade. And this was done within a European context. And we selected 4 test sites, and I'll describe those in a few moments. And then the other point was to develop new hazard indicators, new matrices that could be used, and the data that could be, or indicators that could be quantified, that could then be plugged into a risk-based assessment used for gauging the impact and consequent disruption that occurs from different types of hazards. So next slide, please. So we're aware, as I mentioned, of different types of hazard interactions. We're familiar with periods of drought leading to wildfires, or drought leading to flash flooding on dry, impervious ground. So this is becoming quite familiar in the scientific literature. When we began to review existing databases, for example, the EMDAT database, where we look back over a century of data within a European context, it's discovered that there are many different types of multiple interacting events, and in fact, they account for about almost 2/3, 59% of the actual economic losses that are occurring on both a European and global level. And when we add climate change, and we added increased interdependency and increased level of vulnerability, and from a human perspective, we see that those losses are clearly rising, and they will definitely rise under climate change scenarios that are expected to occur in the next couple of decades. So if we go to the next slide, please. So using broader thinking and available literature, we developed and continued this model of trying to quantify different types of interacting natural hazards. Essentially, there are 4 different elements to put into context today. The first one at the upper right is preconditioned. We can think of a situation where conditions are lined up in a certain order that they allow hazards to occur and they allow quite a large impact to happen. That could be, for example, rainfall on snow, leading to snow melt, leading to sudden thawing, leading to a spring flood. That's quite common in subarctic regions and higher latitude areas of Europe. If we then continue to the right, we have multivariate, where you have different types of maybe one driver in the sense of meteorological conditions, but producing multiple hazards. That could be compound flooding, also extreme precipitation. It could then be a period of also strong wind speeds due to a low pressure system. So you can have one event that spawns different types of hazards, and those hazards have different impacts on different sectors, as we know all too well when we think about daily life during a typical winter storm in Europe. Then additionally, if we move to the lower column, a lower row, I should say, temporary compounding and spatially compounding. If we think about temporary compounding, we can have things that align in time. The timescales can be drastically different. So we can have, again, storms followed by a period of heavy precipitation that could last for several days. Or we could even have a cyclone that would then result in exceptionally dry conditions afterwards, or a sudden change from high pressure to low pressure, as is often the case in the summertime. And then spatially compounding, that's where we have different types of drivers and hazards interacting. So a much more complex situation, longer time scale. Crop failure could be one example, definitely rain on parched surfaces and so on. So we try to split the thinking into this modular sense, assign different drivers, different preconditioning factors, and then provide all of the hazard indicators, which are then used in the later part of the assessment, which Gemma will talk about, and that's the actual impact. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we chose 4 test beds, as Abdegani already mentioned, diverse geographic settings, diverse in terms of population density, socioeconomic activity, and so on, but quite good examples in the sense that they can be the terrain and the types of hazards can be related to many other locations. So we chose Essex in the UK in England, also Nice in the south of France, Oslo in Norway, and a region called Múlaþing in eastern Iceland. Different types of hazards, but all united with similar challenges. We have both remote communities, highly urbanized environments, but interestingly, the impacts in the broadest sense on the built environment and the needs of the users, stakeholders that are working with us in the project are exactly the same, but obviously at the different scales. Next slide, please. So we think about some of these hazards in more detail, and this is now categorized in relation to the so-called test bed or test case regions. So we have the 4 regions that I mentioned, and then we have the different types of hazardous interactions that occur and the typology that we've applied to them. And those that are highlighted in orange, those are the key studies that we've, or examples that in the MEDiate project, we've done much more in-depth analysis. So for Oslo, we put the emphasis on compound flooding, both within the coastal region of Oslo itself, as well as riverine flooding just inland. For Nice, we put an emphasis on extreme heat and drought. In Essex, it was extreme wind and rainfall. And in Iceland, in a region called Seyðisfjörður within Múlaþing, it was heavy rainfall and landslides. Next slide, please. So we just start now with a brief tour of these different regions and think about some of the main compounding and interacting hazards that occur and how we went about classifying the so-called hazard indicators. In Essex, as I mentioned, extreme wind and rainfall can lead to various factors. But in this situation, the threshold for disruption is remarkably low. It's a densely populated environment, both in a coastal and inland setting. And we found that the threshold for disruption was wind speeds exceeding just 10 meters per second in terms of the hazard being documented as causing disruption. If it coincides with a period of rainfall as well, it can obviously lead to multiple cascading impacts. And this is exactly what was captured in this part of the project. So this is a very basic explanation of a much larger analysis that's been done within each area. If we continue, please, to the next slide. So in Essex, then we've been thinking about both baseline conditions in relation to wind and rainfall and expected future conditions. So this is done using climate change scenarios, often the most severe scenario that has been modeled for the region in question. This was done for all of the test beds. So we have the situation today as we see it, and an estimate of hazard intensity, and then how we see the hazard changing in the future. So we think about, for example, wind gusts. We can see very clearly if we compare the baseline and the future for Essex, we see that there'll be greater wind speeds in coastal regions, which makes sense with a more stormy climate, more energy in the atmosphere and humidity and so on. And the same too with rainfall patterns, that when rain does occur, it may be episodic, but it could occur in greater quantities. So next slide, please. So for Oslo, as I mentioned, it's both the coastal surge due to low pressure and a combination of a high tide, and at the same time riverine flooding, which can then lead to water from inland being unable to escape, and causing then both inland flooding and also coastal flooding. An event that could be, given Oslo's terrain and highly urbanized environment, if it's an event of low probability but very high consequence. And these are the types of events that we're trying to capture in the risk analysis, exactly what sort of consequences could occur. And also this type of event is exceptionally well interconnected in terms of the impact it would have on both the natural environment and the built environment. Next slide, please. This comparison doesn't show in great detail the changes, but it's the same sort of thinking. We have both a baseline scenario for the coastal flood-prone areas of Oslo, and we also have the riverine flooding example from just inland of the capital region. And what we see, of course, is that some of this work is limited by the quality of geographic data. So while we do have access to very good global data sets and also local data sets from Oslo Town Council of coastal elevation and so on, we still see that within these two events, there's a 20-year return period and a 200-year return period. We see that there is quite a lot of similarity in inundation area, and this is where we have to apply further thinking in terms of how accurate are the elevation models, how accurate is the surge estimate for water elevation, and how in effect when wind speeds are combined, where would the greatest water levels actually be. So if we continue to the next slide, as we continue the tour around Europe, now we go to Seyðisfjörður. And there we're dealing with, as I mentioned earlier, heavy rainfall triggering landslides. These are landslides that are significant in size. The events that are occurring almost with a return period of a couple hundred years. They require or necessitate the evacuation of coastal villages. So they cause quite a lot of disruption. They affect tourism, damage transport, and so on. And there we've been looking at both using observed data sets and also synthetic estimates of rainfall predictions in the future. We've been thinking about both 5-day rainfall amounts as well as daily maxima and so on, and coming up with various baselines for the return periods. And what we see again is that with higher rainfall, there's a very strong correlation in the future with higher landslide incidences. So next slide, please. Again, for Seyðisfjörður, this is the example of where the landslides are hitting, and this is a very vivid example of the sort of hazards we're dealing with within MEDiate. There we see a coastal town nestled against a steep mountainside, and there in the red you see areas where we have known landslide occurrence, and this is a reoccurring problem. So another element of this research is that we're not just dealing with singular events that happen once in time. They can be self-repeating, and they can migrate short distances. So this is an unstable slope over a distance of say 5 to 10 kilometers, which is repeatedly failing. And very similar problems exist in Norway as well in relation to other types of hazards such as quicklay. And next slide, please. So now we move to some of the temporally compounding events. If we just very briefly focus on Nice again, and as I mentioned in that typology summary earlier, you can have a different type of succession of events that can affect a given geographic region at the same time. And heat waves and drought are very clear and obvious examples. We've been exploring the effects of this and the preconditioning that's needed to cause a drought. And of course, the story doesn't end just with a heat wave, then drought. What then happens when the drought ends and changing weather patterns arrive and higher rate and rainfall occurs, then we deal with all the consequences of very rapid runoff on impervious ground. And that's what's been causing a lot of the hazards in Nice. So there we see an example where we've tried to look into the monthly occurrence of different types of hazards in relation to droughts and heat waves. And in this calendar view, you can see that the drought symbology, you can have both cold and dry, cool and dry conditions in January. And what we found very clearly is that there's a very strong seasonality to the occurrence of hazards, and that hazards tend to interact mostly in June, for instance, where you both have higher humidity, opportunity for higher air temperatures and drought conditions to occur, and also then for storms to occur in terms of intense rainfall. Okay, next slide, please. Then we've taken a look at the how this then for Nice changes in the future. We both have the historical data sets, near future predictions, and far future predictions, and we see the frequency of occurrence of both droughts and heat waves increasing both in the near and far future. So next slide, please. So I think this is the penultimate slide. So we then moved on to thinking about, and this touches then on the part 3 of the presentation, is what can then happen in terms of cascading impacts. If we just take Oslo as one example, and what seemed like quite a mundane interacting event, coastal and riverine flood, what this could actually mean, though, is that in terms of possible disruption to the power generation system, transportation, and so on, there could be knock-on, cascading, and escalating effects, which then can last much longer than the duration of the hazard itself. And this has been also another important element of the MEDiate project. And next slide, please. So lastly, and this is the last slide, if we put this all together in terms of what we've worked on so far, we've been thinking about different types of interacting natural hazards in the 4 test regions. We thought about what the thresholds are for those hazards, how they will be impact will change and severity will change in the future under climate change simulations, and also the consequences, as you can see here in the graphical illustration. What we see is that there's some commonality, and I mentioned that earlier, between all regions, regardless of size, population density. We see immediate impacts on, for example, the transportation networks. We see impacts on telecommunications, and we can then see that how the escalating hazard and the evolving event could actually then cause problems in terms of the first response. If you think about being able to provide emergency support to remote regions, and there I'm thinking particularly Iceland, then you can see how the hazard itself can actually cause all sorts of consequent hazards that could last much longer and actually affect the human response to the hazard. So that was just a very short potted account. We've got a lot of material that's in preparation in terms of papers and so on. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Matthew. Now we jump to the last part, integrating dynamic multi-hazard vulnerability and resilience into formal people-centered and forward-looking risk assessment by Dr. Gemma Kremen.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Abdelghani, and thanks, Matthew. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so let me just set everything up. All right, so as Abdelghani just mentioned, this part is about integrating dynamic, multi-hazard vulnerability and resilience into formal, people-centered and forward-looking risk assessment. Now, that title is really a mouthful, but basically the idea here is to develop a framework that allows us to support decision-making under multi-hazard conditions. So what we do and in a step-by-step manner is we take exposure information. So this is information on people and the built environment in the test beds that Abdelghani and Matthew have already mentioned. And these are the people and the built infrastructure that are exposed to different hazard events. We take information on the multi-hazard interactions and events that Matthew detailed. And the purpose of this part of the work is to select or develop appropriate physical and social vulnerability models that really translate those multi-hazard events and their intensity into effects on society, so negative consequences on society. We then synthesize these negative consequences into a set of what we call risk and resilience metrics, or in other words, measurements of the consequences on society. And we can do this at various points in time, okay, depending on whether we're looking at today's hazards or tomorrow's hazards, or whether we're looking at today's exposure or tomorrow's exposure. Now, what those metrics allow us to do is they allow us to evaluate the effectiveness of adopting different types of risk mitigation and resilience enhancing strategies. So we can use the values associated with different strategies in terms of risk and resilience metrics in order to understand the effectiveness of the different strategies. And that's really how this whole end-to-end framework really allows us to facilitate decision making. So let's go through some of this in a more step-by-step approach. We'll start off with physical and social vulnerability modeling. Now, what do we mean by a physical vulnerability model? So you might have heard the term fragility or vulnerability model when it comes to physical vulnerability modeling. But the idea is that this model translates the intensity of a hazard into the damage consequences it causes to the built environment. So as we might expect, as we increase the intensity of a hazard, the more damage we anticipate from that hazard event on the built environment. So this type of model also takes into account the specific characteristics of the built environment that make it vulnerable to a specific type of hazard. So here we're talking about a fragility or a vulnerability model for a single hazard event, but as Matthew has already described, we were interested in multi-hazard interactions and multi-hazard events in the MEDiate project. So in that case, we're not just looking at one type of hazard intensity, but we're looking at multiple different types of hazard intensities depending on the type of interaction of interest. So in this case, we're looking at predominantly physical vulnerability models that take into account more than one hazard intensity measure to predict damage. So maybe we're interested in a flood following an earthquake, for instance. In that case, we would need to understand the intensity of the earthquake as well as the intensity of the flood in order to predict damage. So this is the way in which we're modeling physical vulnerability in the MEDiate project. So in terms of the work we did in each specific testbed, the first task involved developing a comprehensive database of physical vulnerability models for each of the different testbeds and various types of physical infrastructure in each of these testbeds, like schools, residential buildings, road networks, electric power networks, and also different types of hazards that they might be exposed to, like floods, landslides, earthquakes, and winds. And this database was developed from previous literature. But we also needed to develop bespoke multi-hazard models as part of this work. So for the Nice testbed, for instance, we were modeling the possibility of an earthquake happening, then a flood happening, and how that would translate into damage to the built environment. So that's the physical vulnerability modeling side of MEDiate. But what about the social vulnerability modeling side? Because we're not just interested in the effects on the built environment, we're also interested in modeling the effects of multi-hazard events on people and social infrastructure. Now, when it comes to social vulnerability modeling, social vulnerability is really influenced by many different factors, like the socioeconomic status of an area, its access to education, for instance, different minorities that might be present, and various different types of household characteristics. So if we were going to define social vulnerability, we would define it as the characteristics of people or a group of people that influence their capacity to anticipate and recover from different types of natural hazard events. Now, within the MEDiate project, we're also modeling social consequences, accounting for the inherent interdependencies that exist between people and the built environment. So we're also taking into consideration where people would go to work, where people might go to school, where people might go to hospital, for instance. And therefore, we can translate disruptions to those physical infrastructure into negative consequences on people's everyday lives. So what we did in various different test beds was we characterized what we call a social vulnerability index, a measurement of social vulnerability. And as I mentioned already, this social vulnerability index is influenced by various different factors that relate to, for instance, the population in terms of its age, maybe in terms of its gender, education levels, the economy, etc., various different factors. And so I just want to show you some key results that we had for the Oslo testbed and for the Essex testbed. Now, without getting into too much detail on the exact results, this social vulnerability index did allow us to understand which parts of each testbed were more socially vulnerable than others. And we can also superimpose on top of these types of maps damage to physical infrastructure to get a holistic impression of the effects of hazards on people's everyday lives. So that's the physical and the social vulnerability modeling step. The next step involves synthesizing those models and their outputs into a suite of what we call risk and resilience metrics. So the first step involves characterizing damage to the built environment using those fragility or vulnerability models for either single or multi-hazard events. We then need to understand dependencies between people and the built environment in order to understand disruptions that damage to the built environment have on various different people's lives. And we synthesize all of this information into a set of risk and resilience metrics. Now, there's various different types of risk and resilience metrics that we can characterize. For instance, we can characterize economic type metrics, which might be the repair cost associated with damage to the built environment from a multi-hazard event. Or maybe we're talking about business interruption financial losses. And that's a traditional sort of metric that we would use in conventional multi-hazard or single hazard risk assessments. But in MEDiate, we wanted to develop more bespoke or more holistic, people-centered risk and resilience metrics, like social-orientated metrics. So casualties, but also the unemployment caused by particular multi-hazard events, as well as the inaccessibility to education caused by multi-hazard events. And we could also characterize more sort of environmentally orientated risk and resilience metrics, like the amount of gas that's leaked as a result of damage to gas physical infrastructure, or the amount of CO2 that's emitted as a result of building collapses in multi-hazard events, for instance. So these are generic examples of risk and resilience metrics, but we do see various municipalities in the test beds that we concentrated on in MEDiate already detailing the types of risk and resilience metrics that they would use in their own decision-making on natural hazard, risk mitigation, and resilience enhancing strategies. So this is an example from the Oslo municipality and the various types of risk and resilience metrics of interest to them. So we see some financial related metrics here. We see some social related metrics as well. Okay, so now that we have our risk and resilience metrics in place, we can therefore use them to evaluate the effectiveness of different risk mitigation and resilience enhancing strategies that we might want to implement in a specific test bed. So these risk and resilience metrics are going to guide our whole decision-making process. So what do I mean by risk mitigation and resilience enhancing strategies? So say, for example, we're interested in addressing a flooding problem. In that case, a risk mitigation strategy might be financial assistance provision for homeowners to elevate their residential buildings by a certain amount. We might decide that we want only or to restrict future development away from flood-prone areas. Or we might want to construct flood barriers to prevent flooding of our critical infrastructure. Now, what we can do and what we've developed in MEDiate is a way in which we can evaluate the effectiveness of these different strategies in terms of the values associated with risk and resilience metrics. So we can evaluate their effectiveness in terms of, for example, financial losses, maybe we're looking at more environmental related losses, maybe we're looking at school inaccessibility. So the idea is to take a series of multi-hazard events and quantify the risk and resilience metrics associated with these multi-hazard events, also modeling the various strategies available to us. And therefore, what we can do is we can use these risk and resilience metrics as criteria to evaluate the effectiveness of the strategies. So the overall idea is to choose the risk mitigation and resilience enhancing strategies that really collectively minimize these risk metrics. We can also take into consideration the importance that stakeholders place on different risks and resilience metrics when facilitating this type of decision making. So we can directly involve the stakeholder and the importance they place on minimizing different types of losses when evaluating the effectiveness of the different types of strategies. So that ends my part of this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the very interesting presentations. I think we can go ahead and start the question and answer session. Do we have any questions for the panelists? You can use the Q&A function or the chat function. I have a question in the meantime, directed towards all three of you, so you can feel free to whoever would like to answer. In terms of this research, I think really encapsulates the risks that have been developing, and what if you could envision kind of the future of what might be the next steps in terms of this research and how it might be built on in the future. How would you kind of envision that?
Who would like to, should I reply to that to begin with? I think in terms of how it would evolve, if we think about from the perspective of the slides that I showed from hazard assessment perspective, I think as I mentioned in my introduction, a paradigm shift that hopefully we will see the multiple hazards are treated by default in hazard assessments. It's still surprising when you look at both regional and even national scale hazard assessments for different European countries, that hazards are assessed singularly, and the impacts of those are treated in the same way. And I think as Gemma showed very well, that the socioeconomic impacts of such hazards are immensely complex, and that all needs to be captured, because we know very clearly that insurance costs are rising due to natural hazards globally. So there's all sorts of incentives for us to be better prepared and to really come up with both intermediate and also long-term hazard and ultimately fully risk integrated assessments. And I think that's maybe the other point as well, that we move to comprehensive risk assessment for all major natural hazards.
Also, I think the next step would be also to update the existing risk governance systems, because for now they are single-based, and even because this fact of multi-hazard, multi-risk hazard, so far it has been always within research area, and trying to understand it even between the researcher was not that easy. So it was basically coming to a common understanding between the different researcher and come with a solution that also can be understood and implemented by actors in disaster management. So once this is clear, then they can go to the next stage or next step, which is now they need to update the risk governance systems and come with policies that allows them to manage this shift from a single to multi-hazard risk assessment and modeling and predictions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add as well, basically just following directly on from those two comments, in terms of my own sort of work and what I presented, we really need to improve our physical vulnerability modeling of multi-hazards as well. And so, we've kind of began that process in research, but there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of various different hazard pairings that might occur. And that requires, a comprehensive, I think, collection of data after multi-hazard events that can be used as a basis for these models more generally. And I think we have a way to go as well on actually properly capturing cascading impacts. But again, as you increase the number of hazards that you're considering, this becomes more and more difficult to actually collect data on and therefore develop models on. But at least I think we're shifting our perspectives towards multi-hazards in a more positive way, which is good. And projects like MEDiate are really facilitating that transition or that paradigm shift, as Matthew mentioned.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from the audience before we close the webinar for today? Okay, great. Well, I will go ahead and close the webinar then. All of the recording and the presentation will be published on EENA's website within the next few days. And we will be continuing our EU project series on the 18th of June. We will have a webinar featuring the core project, so we hope to see you there as well. Thank you so much to the panelists who presented today. It was very, very interesting, and I wish you all a nice rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Goodbye all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.